Welcome to a narrated virtual tour that takes you through the evolution of U.S. jet-powered fighter aircraft, starting with the Lockheed F-80 Shooting Star through the Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor. The tour involves aircraft that I personally photographed or videoed, mostly at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, the Smithsonian Udvar-Hazy Center outside of Washington, D.C., or at air shows. Enjoy the video. The Lockheed F-80 Shooting Star was the first American aircraft to exceed 500 miles per hour in level flight, the first American jet airplane manufactured in large quantities, and the first U.S. Air Force jet used in combat. It was armed with 6 50-caliber machine guns and carried either 8 5-inch rockets or 2,000 pounds of bombs. It had a 437 mile-per-hour cruising and 580 mile-per-hour maximum speed with a range of 1,090 miles and a 46,800-foot ceiling. They entered service in 1945 and were retired by the Air Force in 1959. The F-80C was flown as a day fighter, fighter bomber, and photo reconnaissance aircraft during the Korean War. This F-80 is displayed at the Air Force Museum and is one of the few remaining shooting stars that flew combat missions during the Korean War. Grumman's first fighter jet, the F9F Panther, was delivered to the Navy in 1949. It was armed with 4 Mark III 20mm cannon and could carry either 8 5-inch rockets or 3,000 pounds of bombs. It had a cruising speed of 481 miles per hour and a max speed of 575 miles per hour with a range of 1,100 miles and a 42,800-foot ceiling. During the Korean War, both Navy and Marine squadrons used the Panther, with one making the first U.S. Navy jet-versus-jet kill. Panthers were retired by the U.S. Navy in 1958, with the last F9S retired by Argentina in 1969. The North American F86 Saber was the U.S. Air Force's first swept-wing jet fighter and set a world speed record of 670.9 miles per hour. It was armed with 6 50-caliber machine guns, had a max speed of 685 miles per hour, a 12,000-mile range, and a 49,000-foot ceiling. During the Korean War, the Sabre was the Russian-built MiG's primary opponent, shooting down 792 of them with a kill ratio of about 8-to-1. They were introduced in 1949, and the last Sabres were retired in 1994 by the Bolivian Air Force. This F86A Saber is displayed at the Air Force Museum and is painted as the one flown by Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton when he became the first F-86 pilot to shoot down a MiG. Northrop's F89 Scorpion was an all-weather fighter interceptor where a rear-seat radar operator guided the pilot to intercept and destroy enemy aircraft by day or night under all types of weather conditions. Its armament consisted of 2 Genie air-to-air rockets with nuclear warheads plus 4 Falcon missiles. It had a 465 mile-per-hour cruising and 627 mile-per-hour max speed, a 1,600-mile range, and a 45,000-foot ceiling. An F-89J was the first to launch a Genie test rocket with a nuclear warhead, and it detonated over the Nevada Test Range. Scorpion deliveries began in July 1950, and they were retired in 1969. This F-89J is displayed at the Air Force Museum and is the last Scorpion to serve with an operational unit. The Lockheed F94 Starfire was an all-weather interceptor developed from the F80 Shooting Star. It was armed with 24 2.75-inch folding fin air rockets in the nose and 24 in 2 wing pods. It had a 476 mile/hour cruising speed and a max speed of 640 miles per hour, with a range of 1,275 miles and a 51,800-foot ceiling. Starfires were employed in the air defense of the continental United States in the 1950s. It entered service in January 1950 and was retired from the Air Force in 1958 and from the Air National Guard in 1959. This F94C Starfire is painted to represent one assigned to the 60th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Otis Air Force Base, Massachusetts during the late 1950s and is displayed at the Air Force Museum. Introduced in 1953 as the swept-wing successor to the F9F Panther, the F9F Cougar was intended for combat over Korea but arrived too late for the war. It was armed with 4 20mm cannon and carried either 4 Sidewinder missiles or 2,000 pounds of bombs. It had a cruising speed of 541 miles per hour and a max speed of 705 miles per hour, with a 600-mile range and 50,000-foot ceiling. The Cougar saw its sole combat in Vietnam, where 4 two-seat training versions of the aircraft served briefly as forward air control aircraft. It was introduced in 1953 and was retired from the U.S. Navy in 1974. This F9F-6 Cougar served the Navy until 1959 and is on display at the Naval Aviation Museum. The North American F-100 Super Sabre was the world's first production airplane capable of flying faster than the speed of sound in level flight. The F-100D was armed with 4 20mm cannon and a combination of 2 Bulldog missiles, 4 Sidewinder missiles, rockets, special stores, and/or a maximum of 7,040 pounds of bombs. The D model had a 590 mile/hour cruising speed, 926.6 miles per hour max speed, a 1,970 mile range, and a 55,000-foot ceiling. The Super Sabre had its combat debut in Vietnam, where it was used extensively as a fighter bomber in ground support missions such as attacking bridges, road junctions, and troop concentrations. The F100F was built as a 2-seat training version of the Super Sabre. It was armed with 2 20mm cannon and could carry up to 5,000 pounds of external stores. The 2-seat F100F became an important aircraft for 2 new missions: surface-to-air missile suppression, known as Iron Hand, and high-speed forward air control, known as Misty FAC. The Super Sabre was introduced in 1954 and was retired from the United States Air National Guard in 1979 and from the Republic of China Air Force in 1988. This F-100D was used by the Thunderbirds from 1964 to 1968 and is displayed at the Air Force Museum. This F-100F was a Misty FAC aircraft in Vietnam and is painted as it appeared in March 1968 and is also displayed at the Air Force Museum. The North American FJ2 Fury resulted from an effort to navalize the Air Force's capable F86 Saber. It was armed with 4 20mm cannon with a maximum speed of 676 miles per hour, a 990 mile range, and 41,700-foot ceiling. Plagued with problems when operating aboard ship, the FJ2 was flown exclusively by Marine Corps squadrons while in frontline service, but it arrived too late to serve in the Korean War. It was introduced in 1954 and retired in 1962. The Naval Aviation Museum's FJ2 Fury is displayed in the markings of the Naval Air Test Center at Paxton River, Maryland. The North American FJ4 was the final version of the swept-wing Fury fighters delivered to the Navy and was a complete redesign that solved many problems that plagued the earlier models. In order to accommodate an increased internal fuel supply, engineers redesigned the fuselage to make it shorter and deeper while adapting the aircraft's wing design to feature high-lift flaps, a controllable drooping leading edge, and mid-span control surfaces. These modifications transferred into better carrier and high-speed performance. It was armed with 4 20mm cannon and provisions for either 3,000 pounds of ordnance or 4 Sidewinder missiles. It had a 680 mph max speed, a 2,020-mile range, and a 46,800-foot ceiling. It entered service in 1955 and was retired from the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps in 1964. This FJ4 Fury is painted in the markings of the Marine Corps' Red Devil Squadron, is displayed at the Naval Aviation Museum, and is one of only 2 surviving examples. The McDonnell F101 Voodoo was originally designed as a long-range bomber escort, but before production began, its design was changed to fill both tactical and air defense roles. Its armament included 2 Genie unguided nuclear air-to-air rockets plus 2 AIM-4 guided missiles. It had a 545 mph cruising and 1,095 mph max speed, 1,520-mile range, and 52,100-foot ceiling. F101 reconnaissance versions were widely used for low-altitude photo coverage of missile sites during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis and during the late 1960s in Southeast Asia. It was introduced in 1957 and retired from U.S. Air Force in 1972 and in 1982 by the Air National Guard. This F101B is displayed at the Air Force Museum. The Convair F102 Delta Dagger was the world's first supersonic all-weather jet interceptor and the U.S. Air Force's first operational delta-wing aircraft. It had a 600 mph cruising and 810 mph max speed, a 1,000-mile range, and a 55,000-foot ceiling. It was armed with 24 unguided 2.75-inch rockets and 6 guided missiles. Its main purpose was to be the backbone of American air defense and to intercept approaching Soviet strategic bomber fleet, primarily the Tupolev Tu-95, during the Cold War. It was introduced in 1956 and retired in 1979. This F101B Delta Dagger is displayed at the Air Force Museum. The F3H Demon was McDonnell Aircraft Corporation's first swept-wing aircraft, but was an infamously troubled aircraft. Engine problems plagued the first version of the airplane, resulting in 11 crashes and the deaths of 4 pilots between 1952 and 1955. It was armed with 4 20mm cannon and 4 Sparrow 3 missiles. Its maximum speed was 727 miles per hour at sea level, with an 1,180-mile range and a 42,650-foot ceiling. It complemented daylight dogfighters such as the F8U Crusader and the F11F Tiger as carrier-based all-weather missile-armed interceptors. It was introduced in 1956 and was retired in 1964. This F3H-2M has the markings of Fighter Squadron 193 and is displayed at the Naval Aviation Museum. Douglas's Delta Wing F4D Skyr holds the distinction of being the first carrier aircraft to hold world speed and climb records. It was armed with 4 20mm cannon and could carry up to 4,000 pounds of ordnance. It had a 722 mile-per-hour max speed, a 1,200-mile range, and a 55,000-foot ceiling. Skyray served in the all-weather Fighter Squadron 3 that was the only Navy squadron assigned to the North American Air Defense Command. The Skyray entered service in 1956 and was phased out in 1964. This F4D-1 is displayed at the Naval Aviation Museum. Grumman's F11 Tiger featured thin-swept wings, incorporated spoilers instead of ailerons, and its Coke bottle-shaped fuselage design enabled it to exceed Mach 1. 4 20mm cannon and the provisions for 4 Sidewinder missiles armed the Tiger. Its cruising speed was 577 miles per hour, with a top speed of 728 miles per hour, along with an 1,110-mile range and 49,000-foot ceiling. The Tiger saw limited service as its appearance coincided with 2 more capable fighters, the F8U Crusader and the F4H Phantom II, but it did serve with the Blue Angels between 1957 and 1969. It was introduced in 1956 and retired from carrier service in 1961, from training in 1967, and from the Blue Angels in 1969. The Naval Aviation Museum's F11F-1 Tiger flew with the Blue Angels from 1967 to 1969. Chance-fought F-8 Crusaders retained 20mm cannon as its primary armament at a time when radar-guided missiles were becoming the norm, hence the nickname Last of the Gunfighters. In addition to the cannon, it could carry 4 Sidewinder missiles and up to 5,000 pounds of ordnance. F-8s had a cruising speed of 308 miles per hour with a max speed of 1,133 miles per hour, had a range of 1,425 miles, and a 52,350-foot ceiling. Crusaders flew their first combat missions triggering cameras instead of weapons as part of the photo reconnaissance flights over Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. They also logged reconnaissance missions as well as strike and combat air patrol flights throughout the Vietnam War, with Crusader pilots credited with the downing of 18 enemy MiGs in aerial combat. F-8 Crusaders entered service in 1957 and were retired by the U.S. Navy in 1976, while the RF-8 was retired in 1987. This F-8A Crusader is displayed at the Naval Aviation Museum, while this RF-8G is on display at the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center. The Lockheed F104 Starfighter served as a tactical fighter when armed with a 6-barrel M61 20mm Vulcan cannon and as a day-night interceptor when heat-seeking Sidewinder missiles are added. It could also carry nuclear or conventional bombs. It had a 575 mile-per-hour cruising and 1,320 mile-per-hour maximum speed, a 1,250-mile range, and a 58,000-foot ceiling. Starfires were used extensively during the Vietnam War in both the air superiority and air support roles. It was also deployed extensively as a barrier combat air patrol protector for the EC-121D Warning Star airborne early warning aircraft patrolling off the North Vietnamese coast. They entered service in 1958 and were retired from the U.S. Air Force in 1969 and from the Air National Guard in 1975. This F104 Starfighter is on display at the Air Force Museum. Republic's F105 Thunder Chief was developed as a supersonic tactical fighter bomber and was nicknamed the Thud. The F105D was armed with 1 Vulcan 20mm cannon and could carry more than 12,000 pounds of ordnance. It had a 778 mile-per-hour cruising and a 1,390 mile-per-hour max speed with a 2,206-mile range and a 51,000-foot ceiling. THUADs saw extensive use during the Rolling Thunder campaign against North Vietnam. The F105G Weasel III was equipped with advanced radar, jamming equipment, improved countermeasures, heavier armament, and could fire anti-radiation missiles that could seek out radar emplacements. They were tasked with suppression of enemy air defenses, destroying the radars and surface-to-air missile installations of enemy air defense systems. Thunder Chiefs were introduced in 1958 and were retired in 1984. Both the F105D Thunder Chief, shown here, and the F105G Wild Weasel III, shown here, are displayed at the Air Force Museum. The Convair F106 Delta Dart all-weather interceptor was developed from the F102 Delta Dagger. It carried one Genie air-to-air nuclear missile plus 4 Falcon air-to-air missiles. Its cruising speed was 650 miles per hour and had a max speed of 1,525 miles per hour, with a 1,500-mile range and a 53,000-foot ceiling. The Delta Dart used a Hughes MA-1 electronics guidance and fire control system where the aircraft could automatically fly to the proper altitude and attack position, fire the Genie and Falcon missiles, break off the attack run, and return the aircraft to the vicinity of its base without pilot input. It entered service in 1959, and between June 1983 and August 1988 were incrementally retired, with some converted to target drones. This F106A Delta Dart is on display at the Air Force Museum. North American built 3 prototype F107As as part of the Tactical Fighter Bomber competition, but the contract was awarded for the Republic F105 Thunder Chief. The second prototype was used for weapons testing, then was displayed at the Air Force Museum, but this plane is now in storage. The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II quickly demonstrated that it was a special aircraft, establishing over a dozen world speed, altitude, and time to climb records. Its armament consisted of Sparrow and Sidewinder air-to-air missiles and up to 16,000 pounds of ordnance. It had a cruising speed of 580 miles per hour, with a max speed of 1,485 miles per hour, a 2,300-mile range, and a 62,000-foot ceiling. For over 2 decades, Phantom II served as both the Navy and Air Force's premier air superiority aircraft and flew with both the Blue Angels and the Air Force Thunderbirds. The escalation of the war in Vietnam thrust the F-4 into a tactical environment for which it was not originally designed, yet by war's end it had performed well in air-to-air combat and ground attack missions, with Navy and Marine Corps aviators scoring 36 kills. The Phantom II was introduced in 1960 and was retired from U.S. combat use in 1996, with the last ones retired by Japan in 2021. This F-4N Phantom II is painted in the markings of its final squadron, Fighter Squadron 154, operating from the carrier Midway. This F-4S Phantom II, displayed at the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center, flew combat air patrol and bombing missions during the Linebacker II bombing campaign in 1972. The U.S. Air Force's version of the McDonnell Douglas Phantom II, the F-4C, made its first flight in May 1963, with delivery starting 6 months later. It could carry up to 16,000 pounds of external ordnance, including Falcon, Bullpup, Sparrow, and Sidewinder missiles and nuclear weapons. It had a 590-mile-per-hour cruising and a 1,400-mile-per-hour max speed, with a 1,750-mile range and 59,600-foot ceiling. The U.S. Air Force sent its first F-4Cs to Southeast Asia in 1965, where they flew air-to-air missions against North Vietnamese fighters as well as attacking ground targets. The RF-4C Phantom II carried a variety of cameras in 3 different stations in its nose section, taking photos at both high and low altitudes, day or night. The F4G Wild Weasels were modified fighters with their cannons replaced by electronic warfare equipment. The Wild Weasel mission was to attack enemy air defenses, including surface-to-air missile air defense radars. They carried no offensive armament, although during the last few years of its service, some were fitted with 4 Sidewinder missiles for defense. The displayed F4C armament was a typical configuration for 1967, consisting of 4 Sparrow and 4 Sidewinder missiles and 8 750-pound bombs. This RF-4C served in Vietnam, Japan, Korea, Europe, Cuba, and the Middle East. During Desert Shield/Desert Storm, it flew 172 missions, more than any other F-4 aircraft. This F-4G, along with the F-4C and the RF-4C, are displayed at the Air Force Museum. An interesting feature of the General Dynamics F111A aardvark was its variable geometry wings that allowed them to be swept forward for takeoffs, landings, or low-speed flights, and swept back for high-speed flights. It was armed with one 20mm Vulcan Gatling-type rotary cannon and up to 24 conventional or nuclear weapons. It had a 685 mph cruising and 1,452 mph max speed, with a 3,632-mile range and a 57,000-foot ceiling. In the spring of 1968, the operational test in Southeast Asia resulted in mixed success. As a personal note, I remember seeing many F-111 low-level flights over Camp Radcliffe in the Central Highlands at that time. In 1972, after correcting these problems, the F-111A returned to Southeast Asia for Operation Linebacker 2, where it conducted very effective night strikes against North Vietnamese targets. The F-111F was equipped with an all-weather infrared targeting designator/reader carried in a pod-mounted turret under the fuselage that could track and designate ground targets for laser, infrared, and electro-optical bombs. The F-111F was one of the most effective Allied aircraft in Operation Desert Storm, flying more than 2,400 sorties against Iraqi strategic sites, vehicle formations, and hardened bunkers. The aardvark entered service in 1967 and was retired from the Air Force in 1996. This F-111A is marked as it appeared in 1972 and 73 during Operation Linebacker 2. This F-111F flew in combat in 1991 during Operation Desert Storm, and both the A and F variants are displayed at the Air Force Museum. With the U.S. Navy needing a fleet defense fighter with high speed that could carry heavy ordnance, Grumman produced the highly effective F14 Tomcat that could operate at a wide range of airspeeds due to its variable sweep wing. It was armed with one 20mm Vulcan Gatling-type rotary cannon, plus either 4 Sparrow and 4 Sidewinder missiles, or 6 Phoenix and 2 Sidewinder missiles. It had a max speed of 1,444 miles per hour, Mach 2.34, a 580-mile combat range, an 1,800-mile ferry range, and a 35,000-foot ceiling. The Tomcat saw its first combat in August 1981, downing 2 Libyan Su-22 fighters over the Gulf of Sidra, and went on to see considerable duty in the Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It was delivered to the Navy in 1972, with the last Tomcat retired in 2006. This Naval Aviation Museum's F-14A is the 5th Tomcat produced and was one of the prototypes used in the early testing of the aircraft. And this F-14A on a pedestal greets visitors at the Naval Aviation Museum. The McDonnell F-15 Eagle was a twin-engine, high-performance, all-weather air superiority fighter. Its armament consisted of one 20mm Gatling-type rotary Vulcan cannon, 4 Sparrow and 4 Sidewinder missiles, plus 15,000 pounds of mixed ordnance carried externally. It had a maximum speed over 1,875 miles per hour, Mach 2.5, a combat range of 1,221 miles, a ferry range of 3,500 miles, and a 65,000-foot ceiling. Later Eagle versions, not shown, participated in Operation Desert Storm, accounting for 32 of the 36 Air Force air-to-air victories, and also attacked Iraqi ground forces. Eagles also served in Bosnia, Operation Allied Force, enforced the no-fly zone over Iraq, and hit Afghan targets in Operation Enduring Freedom. This F-15A was photographed at the Air Force Museum on October 18, 2023, but a note on the Air Force website shows that it was moved to storage on October 25, 2023. The General Dynamics F-16 Fighting Falcon evolved from a 1972 U.S. Air Force lightweight fighter prototype program which sought a small, lightweight, low-cost air superiority day fighter designed for high performance and ease of maintenance. Its armament consisted of one 20mm Gatling-type rotary Vulcan cannon and various combinations of air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles and bombs. It has a 577 mile per hour cruising speed, a 1,345 mile per hour max speed, a 339 mile combat range, a 1,407 mile ferry range, and a 55,000-foot ceiling. The U.S. Air Force flew F-16s in combat during Operation Desert Storm in 1991 and in the Balkans later in the 1990s. They also patrolled the no-fly zones in Iraq during Operation Northern Watch and Southern Watch and served during the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq from 2001 and 2003 respectively. In 2011, Air Force F-16s took part in the intervention in Libya. The F-16N Viper was used by the U.S. Navy as an aggressor aircraft during air combat training, simulating the capabilities of fourth-generation Soviet fighters. The Fighting Falcon was introduced in 1978 and remains in service with the U.S. Air Force and 25 other users. The F-16A Fighting Falcon displayed at the Air Force Museum is one of the first F-16s received by the Thunderbirds in 1982. Lockheed's F117A Nighthawk was the world's first operational stealth aircraft. It could carry up to 5,000 pounds of internal stores. It had a 684 mile per hour max speed. Its range was 1,070 miles, and it had a 45,000-foot ceiling. During Operation Desert Storm, F-117As flew 1,271 sorties, achieving an 80% mission success rate, and suffered no losses or battle damage. It was introduced in 1982, and as of 2024 is still in use as a training aircraft. The F-117A Nighthawk on display at the Air Force Museum is the second F-117A built and was specifically modified for systems testing. The McDonnell Douglas FA-18 Hornet became the frontline naval strike fighter shortly after fleet introduction in the mid-1980s. Its armament includes one 20mm Gatling-type Vulcan rotary cannon and provisions for 17,000 pounds of ordnance, including Sparrow and Sidewinder air-to-air missiles, general-purpose bombs, Maverick and Harm missiles, and Walleye glide bombs. Its maximum speed is 1,190 miles per hour. It has a 460-mile combat range, a 1,253-mile ferry range, and a 50,000-foot ceiling. The FA-18 first saw combat action in April 1986 when Hornets from the USS Coral Sea flew suppression of enemy air defense missions against Libyan air defenses during Operation Prairie Fire and then flew ground attack missions in Benghazi as part of Operation El Dorado Canyon. During the Gulf War of 1991, the Navy deployed 106 and the Marine Corps deployed 84 Hornets. Hornets also flew in Operation Southern Watch over Bosnia and Kosovo, Operation Enduring Freedom in the North Arabian Sea, and Operation Iraqi Freedom. Hornets were introduced in 1983 and retired in 2019, being replaced by Super Hornets, not shown. The Naval Aviation Museum's F-18 Hornet was originally displayed with Blue Angel markings, but was repainted in the tactical paint scheme of its former operational squadron, the FA-25. The Lockheed Martin F-22A Raptor is the world's first stealthy air dominance fighter, combining stealth, maneuverability, and the ability to fly long distance at supersonic speeds, or supercruise, in performance of air superiority and air-to-ground missions. Its armament consists of one 20mm Gatling-type rotary Vulcan cannon with 480 rounds, internal side weapon bays that can carry two Sidewinder infrared missiles, and main internal bays that can carry either 6 radar-guided missiles air-to-air loadout or 2 radar-guided air-to-air missiles and 2 1,000-pound GBU-32 JDAMs air-to-ground loadout. It has a super cruise speed of 1,220 miles per hour, Mach 1.82, with a 1,500 miles per hour max speed, Mach 2.25, has a combat range of 530 miles, a ferry range of 1,800 miles, and a ceiling of 65,000 feet. During September 2014 and July 2015, F-22s flew 204 sorties over Syria, dropping 270 bombs at some 60 locations. Throughout their deployment, F-22s conducted close air support and also deterred Syrian, Iranian, and Russian aircraft from attacking U.S.-backed Kurdish forces and disrupting U.S. operations in the region. Raptors entered service in 2005, and the Air Force expects to begin retiring them in the 2030s. This F-22 is displayed at the Air Force Museum and is one of 9 built for engineering, manufacturing, and development testing, and is painted to represent an F-22A flown by the 1st Fighter Wing at Langley Air Force Base. I hope you enjoyed this narrated virtual tour covering the evolution of U.S. jet-powered fighter aircraft. Links to similar tours are found in the comment section below this video, and more are added as they become available. This page may show YouTube recommended links to similar videos.